I'm Shilo Brooks. I'm a professor and CEO, and I believe reading good books makes us better men. Today, I'm talking with Dr. Cornel West. Dr. West is a renowned teacher, theologian, and activist. Plato's Republic, written over 2,000 years ago, changed Dr. West's life. Today, I'm asking him why. This is Old School. Dr. West, pleasure to have you here. So let me start this way. You were born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is kind of the middle of nowhere. I was born in the middle of nowhere in Lubbock, Texas. We both ended up studying philosophy, teaching the best books that have ever been written. So I want to hear the story of how you got from Tulsa, Oklahoma to the life of wonder, the philosophic life. How did you get there?
Wonderful question. I actually was deeply tied to Granddad's church, Metropolitan Baptist Church, which today is still the biggest Black Baptist church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so for me, it was always a matter of wrestling with the book of Job and wrestling with the life of Jesus and trying to make sense of the world by leading with love and trying to love your way through the darkness, the cruelty of the world. And when I encountered Kierkegaard in a bookmobile, it changed my life.
That'll do it. How old were you when you found
I was about 14 years old, living on the chocolate side of Sacramento. You see, I only stayed in Tulsa, Oklahoma for a few weeks.
Yeah.
Moved to Topeka, Kansas, where my sister was born, Cynthia. Then I made it to Sacramento.
Sacramento.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I was reading all the time. I mean, for me, reading has been nearly as integral as music. The only thing more integral to me other than reading and music is loving mama and daddy. But it was Kierkegaard that opened the world for me as one deeply shaped by a Christian formation.
Well, tell me about finding the Republic. You've mentioned you found Kierkegaard at 14, but when I asked you to select a book that had changed your life, you selected Plato's Republic. Do you remember how you found it, the first time you read it, the impact that it had on you at that time?
Yeah, it was in Stanley Cavell's great course on Hum 5, Humanities 5 at Harvard, that he had assigned Antigone, and then we read parts of the Republic. And I had read the Apology, an unexamined life is not worth living. So I already had viewed Socrates through an existential lens, through a Kierkegaardian lens, or really through a Book of Job lens, that great work of world poetry and Hebrew scripture. So that for me, when I got a chance to read the Republic as a whole, my God, brother, man. I mean, Plato is in the same zone as Dante and Shakespeare and Cervantes and Dostoevsky and Milton and the Faulkners and Toni Morrisons. These are the great literary artists wrestling with what it means to be human. But Plato also was a philosopher with no peer in the West. But when I read the whole thing, the fusion of the poetic and the prosaic, of the philosophical on the one hand and the literary on the other, and then the political and the personal, the existential and the economic and the social and the spiritual.
Let me ask you this question. So the Republic, one of the most remarkable features about the Republic and really about Socrates is that he begins with ordinary opinion. And by that, I mean he begins with a simple question that people on the street to whom he speaks can understand. In the case of the Republic, it's, what is justice? It's not a categorical imperative from Kant where you got to, or Hegel's phenomenology. It's not like most philosophy where you begin with this complex linguistic word salad.
Right.
Socrates meets you where you are. What is virtue? What is justice? So let me ask you this about the Republic. Let's say you and me are just sitting having drinks. I've never read the Republic. Can you tell me, what is the Republic about? What is that book about?
I would say that it is the answer to the most fundamental question that sits at the core of the human condition. William James put it this way in the Gift of Lectures of the Varieties of Religious Experience: the call for help. And what is the Republic? It is the attempt to turn to Socrates of the younger generation. You got the young brothers, hungry for an answer to the challenge of Thrasymachus. Might makes right. Power dictates morality. Right. Philosophy itself is nothing but a weapon to be used by the strong against the weak. That's Thrasymachus. And you got the young brothers looking to Socrates. Can you provide a response? Can you help us deal with this kind of nihilism, this kind of unbelievable, not just relativism, but almost a fatalism, a refusal to really want to elevate oneself and transcend oneself beyond all of the ugly greed and hatred and envy and resentment that they see in everyday life.
The Republic is medicine for an affliction. That affliction is bound up with, in a certain way, indignance about the world, about what justice is. You mentioned might makes right. A young person, a young man who looks out on the world and says, you know what? There ain't no such thing as justice. Everybody's out to get what they're out to get, all they can. Who gives a crap about anybody else?
That's
Let's
right.
go get and take for ourselves. Now, that's Glaucon. One of the major characters' position is he comes to Socrates and says, Socrates, why should I be a just man
That's right.
when I could live the life of a tyrant and I could live the life of pleasure and taking and power? Defend justice to me. Show me that justice is a worthwhile way of life, even or especially when nobody's looking, I should still be just.
That's
Even
right.
when nobody sees me, I should be just in my own house, in my own room, those kinds of things. That's a very powerful statement. It's a heavy burden to place on Socrates. So I'm curious what you make of Socrates' attempt to do that for Glaucon, to say, Glaucon, look, we could look in the soul of an individual for the goodness of justice, but in fact, let's build an imaginary city in which we make justice our animating principle, and every policy and every aspect of this city we're going to create so that it achieves justice. And that way we can see justice writ large rather than
Yes.
in your soul. What do you make? How do you evaluate the defense of justice that Socrates makes against the nihilists, against the cynics that you're talking about?
Well, it's an interesting paradox, and this is true for Plato as a whole, because on the one hand, Plato is always revolutionary, subversive in the generic sense of calling into question what is in place, unsettling conventional morality. And of course, that's what gets Socrates in trouble.
Yeah.
And Plato's end and aim in life is to make the world safe for Socrates, to make sure that every generation that comes after him has to come to terms with the life and witness of Socrates. And Socrates himself never writes a word, just
Right.
like Jesus.
Right.
So the only way in which people will know about Socrates will be the Socratic writers. But making the world safe for Socrates is what? It's a matter of saying that there is a response to nihilism. There is a response to the kind of fatalism, the sense of believing that the world is not so much about the 10 Commandments, but the 11th commandment, thou shalt not get caught. It's more than just survival of the slickest and the richest and the clever, that there's something about virtue and the virtues, about courage, about justice, about temperance, and then, of course, for Christians like myself, about faith, hope, and love. And so, so on the one hand, Plato is defending virtue in the face of the most formidable challenge. On the other hand, when he's writ large, he becomes very authoritarian. He becomes obsessed with control. The very freedom that's at work in his form, and he's using the dialogue.
Yeah.
The dialogue is an open form. Democracy will produce the tyrant because democracy is about what? Unruly passion, pervasive ignorance of citizens who are obsessed with pleasure and not virtue. And of course, we got to keep in mind, it's the democracy that killed his master. It was the demos that voted for Socrates going under, just like the demos have voted for Jesus to be crucified, but that's another issue. So that Plato, on the one hand, is an example of open-mindedness, of unbelievable commitment to parrhesia and free speech and plain speech. And yet when it comes to his thought experiment politically and socially, it is deeply authoritarian. The poets have no role unless they sing songs to great men and the gods. He bans the flute, and of course that's upsetting for me.
Well, I
as,
want to ask you about
as
that.
a jazz man. Anybody who created a social regime, they can't have the flute played. Oh, come on, Plato.
Well,
What's going on?
Well, let me ask you about this authoritarian aspect of the Republic. So for people who haven't read it, that Glaucon asked Socrates to defend justice. Socrates says, "All right, I'm going to do that by creating an imaginary city that is perfectly just." we get into this imaginary city and things end up happening like censoring poetry, like banning music. There's a communism of women and children in which children are taken from their mothers at birth. There is a elaborate system to sort all of the natures of human beings into classes, the gold, the silver, and the bronze,
That's right.
based on their quality and characteristics. So there's extraordinary social engineering and censorship. Now, this can be read several ways. One, it could be read, Plato advocates for social engineering, eugenics, and censorship. But another way, and the way I'm tempted to read it, and I wonder what you make of this, is Plato shows us what would be required for the kind of justice that we hope for. Namely, it might be radical politics. The problem with those radical politics is that they themselves seem to produce injustices with which we are dissatisfied. What that leads to is not a perfect definition or solution of what justice is, but rather a moderation of our hopes for the justice we can realize in this world, given the political limitations of what we can do. I see young people chanting the words justice, writing it on the walls, screaming for it always and everywhere in all sorts of circumstances. I think that's good. But at the same time, our hopes for justice, that justice can be good for everyone when it's done. You know, Socrates brings this out. It has to be good for the doer and good for the person to whom it's done.
That's right.
It has to, you want to help friends, but you may harm enemies. But then how can justice be harmful to people if it's good? And you get into all these contradictions. So my question for you is, at the end of the day, when you see this imaginary city with all of its richness, but also all of its tragedy, what are we to take home about the question, what is justice, from this bizarre utopia that's been constructed?
Now, you're right. When the triple waves that he generates, the elimination of family and abolition of private property, and then philosophers being rulers, he reaches the point where he says, look, I am so desperate when I look at the human condition that the only sense of being able to defend justice is to create a situation in which those who have access to the idea of the agathon, the idea of the good, those who have access to truth, or at least are interested in the pursuit of truth, they also should wield power. Plato's desperation leads toward him being a control freak, surveillance, eugenics, infanticide, all the things that so many of us, if not all of us, view as unjust and immoral. He's wrong about that. But he's not caving into the Callicleses and the Gorgias or the Thrasymachus and the Republic, who are outright defenders of nihilism. And I think the message for young people these days is that you live in a culture which is so many ways a joyless quest for insatiable pleasures. You can gain access to any kind of titillation and stimulation, any kind of addiction and distraction, but your soul can still be empty. Your heart can still be cold. Your conscience can still be coarsened.
Yeah.
See, that's what Plato's speaking to, even in 2025. Now, Plato also is going to argue that any society is going to have its mechanisms of censorship, of control, forms of education that will shape the souls of the young folk. And by souls, we mean their fundamental orientations toward the world. But those of us who are committed to more libertarian and democratic social experiments, highly critical of Plato's authoritarianism, recognize that Plato is always that major skeleton in the closet with which we must wrestle with and come to terms, even if we disagree with his conclusions, because we agree with his starting point. Young people looking to Socrates, we must look to traditions that provide us with resources to come to terms with meaninglessness, hopelessness, lovelessness, touchlessness, grinlessness. That's what nihilism lived is all about.
I mean, you're talking about having to come to terms with Plato, especially for young people. I think that's true. One aspect of this book that always strikes me, though, is the, of course, famous Socratic irony. It's not obvious to me that Plato is an authoritarian, that he does recommend these things, or that that's not in some ways ironic, meant to show us something deeper about what justice is in the world and how it's deployed and what it looks like when we You see when we get it out there. So I hesitate myself to say this is what Plato teaches, primarily because Socrates claims not to teach anything, and he only ever asks questions. And this is a feature that our listeners should be acquainted with. Socrates only asks questions. He claims not to have knowledge. It's, in a way, his antagonists, the sophists, who do.
Plato is a catastrophic thinker.
Yeah.
He's born during the plague. He's wrestling with authoritarian rule of the 30s. He's wrestling with elites out of control, but doing what? Engaging in, the highest philosophic achievement, which is in many ways the Republic and his 25 dialogues, as a critique of the highest political achievement, which was Pericles and democracy. He's got a deep suspicion of the demos.
Yeah.
He really does.
He does.
Now, Socrates is very different. His master is very different because Socrates really doesn't have any positive alternative. He doesn't have any constructive. He says, I go about infecting others with the perplexity I have. That's what he says in Meno, right? That's my calling. I'm a midwife. Right? All I'm doing is allowing things to be birthed. Whereas Plato, his student, comes along and says, I follow that Socratic spirit and energy, a sense of inquiry, but I've got a positive vision that my master doesn't have. And yet, I do agree with you, he's so slippery.
Yeah.
And it's just hard to know where he lands. In that sense, he's like Shakespeare. What does Shakespeare believe? Nobody knows. What was Shakespeare's religion? Nobody knows. What was his philosophy? Where he carried Montaigne in his back pocket, the Florio translation of Montaigne, and the Bible on the other pocket. But what did he believe? We have no idea, really. Hamlet doesn't speak for him. Lear doesn't speak for him. In the end, Socrates doesn't really speak for Plato. I agree with you there. There's an ironic distance. Yeah. Again, great artist, great literary artist. Yet we know he's much more constructive than Socrates himself. You would agree with me on that?
I do. I would agree with that.
Old School is proudly brought to you by the Jack Miller Center. The Jack Miller Center's mission is to reinvigorate education in America's founding principles by empowering professors, supporting teachers, and bringing civic education to millions of students nationwide. If you believe in educating the next generation to sustain American ideals, join us at jackmillercenter.org.
You've done a good job so far saying why this book is the cornerstone of Western philosophy. The Republic is that book with which every philosopher worth any weight at all reckons. And some point, somehow, it is that book. It's the one book. It's the text of Western philosophy, right? And so I'm curious why this thing continues to endure. Why should somebody pick it up? Because I think a lot of students would say, this thing's 2,000 plus years old. The world has changed. Who cares about what some ancient Greek thought? And yet you and I are sitting here saying the greatest minds to have proceeded after Plato for 2,000 years all had to confront the Republic. Why is that? And why in 2025 should a young person sitting at home wondering what to do next say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to stage a confrontation with the greatest book that intelligent people say has ever been written. Why? How does it held that sway over us?
We tell our young precious brothers and sisters of all colors, of all countries, of all sexual orientation, the religious and non-religious identities. Plato sets the scene of instruction for any philosophic inquiry, especially in the West, but I think in the world. What is the scene? The distinction between reality and appearance, the distinction between knowledge and opinion, the distinction between nature and convention, the distinction between philosophers and sophists, the distinction between a world that is recurrent, that is constant, what he'd call a realm of being, versus a world of becoming that's changing, drifting, flowing all the time. And you can take a position against Plato. He certainly takes a position in favor of reality and knowledge and philosopher and so on. And Nietzsche says, no, Platonism is one of the worst things that come along. But you want to flip the script. Okay, Nietzsche, you're still on the same terrain that he laid out. No young person can come to terms with their lives, with what it means to be human, what it means to live a life from their mama's womb to tomb without wrestling with reality versus appearance. Things seem to be this way, but they're not. You don't say. I thought she loved me. She doesn't. I thought no. I thought that what the scientists said in 1900 was a nature reality. They changed their minds. They got better theories. Things are forever changing, but that doesn't mean, in fact, that there's not some reality behind the veil of appearance. Same would be true in terms of the struggle against Homer. I mean, there's a sense in which the Republic is the first effort for the Greeks to replace Homer as a source of paideia, the source of education.
Yeah.
And what's going to replace it? Dialectics. What's dialectics? A sense of the whole. What's a sense of the whole? Philosophy. Right? That love of wisdom, philosophia, emerges in Plato over against the inferior wisdom that he thinks is at work in Homer. So you get this wonderful clash of philosophy versus poetry. Well, that's going to persist up into this very day. You could tell the young folk, oh, I say you listen to a little Kendrick Lamar, huh? Mm-hmm. Did you listen to Mortal Man and his wrestling with Tupac? How come Tupac was silent? Tupac, how do you pass on the wisdom to the younger generation? Stops. Kendrick, what are you saying? Everybody has to have traditions of education that allow people to draw distinction between reality and appearance and knowledge and opinion and be able to cultivate the capacity to love, not just wisdom. Because, of course, Socrates never cries, never sheds a tear, which means he never loved anybody.
Right.
Got to get to the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem for that.
Right.
Love neighbor.
Yeah.
Jesus loved neighbor and enemy. That's different than loving wisdom.
The word of the day is dialectic. What does dialectic mean? It's something that we don't do enough of today. Maybe it's easier to define by saying what it doesn't mean. What it doesn't mean is you're sitting with a friend and you're holding forth and you're saying all the things that you think are true, and then they wait for a pause in the conversation so that they can say all the things that they think are true, and then you walk away. That's not dialectic. Dialectic requires listening. It requires asking precise questions, listening to your interlocutor's response, and then furthering the discourse on the basis of that response. So what you get with the dialectic is a deepening, a gradual deepening over time of a conversation by way of the reasoned exchange of ideas which respond to the specifics as they are exchanged. That's very different from what we do on social media, which is just shouting your view, and then the other person shouts their view. But you engage in correspondence and exchange of ideas in pursuit together of the truth. Dialectic doesn't simply imply or require a clash. It's not a clash. It's not an argument. It's an attempt to come to some mutual understanding to pursue the truth in steps. It's a collaborative effort, not a combative one. And I think we've sort of lost sight of that. Let me ask you this. You just mentioned the way the Republic seems to venerate and show the superiority of the philosophic life.
Yes.
This is a canonical question. You know, Aristotle talks about the priority of the philosophic life and the political life, or the life of the poets. You mentioned, and I want to ask you about that because you strike me as somebody who lives the philosophic life in a certain way through their deeds, acknowledges its superiority, and yet you're a poetic man. You love music, and you mentioned earlier that, of course, there's much music outlawed in the Republic, and I wanted to get your reaction to that. But more than that, I wanted to get you to evaluate this claim and tell people why Plato would say the philosophic life over and above the political and the poetic is the best way. Because today, as young people say, you don't want to be too judgy. You don't want to say what's best. Is it better to be on Wall Street or is it better to go to a nonprofit? I hear Princeton students arguing about this stuff all the time. But Plato comes out and says, pursue the life of philosophy. It's the best way of life. Why is the philosophic way of life the best way of life? And how do you make sense of that in your own soul, given your well-known and powerful attractions to poetry and music?
Well, I can tell you this, my brother. I think one of the reasons why your courses at Princeton were the biggest courses and you won the teaching awards was that you recognized that the young people had to have some alternative, especially the young brothers of all colors. They had to have some alternative to the careerism and the opportunism and the hedonism and the narcissism that is so pervasive in contemporary culture. They want something deeper than that. They want something that's more real. They want it to be nourished by something more than just commodities and possession and spectacle and image and position and status. That's a human thing. Plato was making the same point thousands of years ago
Yeah.
to 2025. Same point. We human beings are constituted in such a way that we have a need to love and be loved. We have a need to have some sense of meaning. We have a need to get outside of ourselves and feel as if life can present to us ways of nourishing and flourishing that goes far beyond money, which is to say, richness measured in terms of what money cannot buy: love, trust, faith, quality relationship, friendship, sense of community. You can't buy those things.
Yeah.
All the money in the world, all the billionaires running around praying for them. I pray for them because it looks like their lives are so empty. They're not really rich in the way Plato's talking about it.
One of the things that comes up these days, as you know, is that something like these classical authors, and classics as a discipline is in utter disarray in my point of view, because people will say these authors have nothing to teach diverse peoples. Now, you obviously don't think that. And I was reading Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail in which he quotes, he mentions Socrates 3 times in that letter. So my question for you is, how do you see these classic books, classic Greek books in particular, animating the Black intellectual tradition? And what would, since I think you and I are on the same page on this, your critique be of those who say these books by old white pagans can't teach us, our people, anything? You seem to disagree with that. So how do you see the classic authors, who I can tell are near and dear to your heart, fitting into that intellectual tradition?
Oh, I mean, I wouldn't even say they just fit in. I think that they are integral and constitutive in the same way that Black life, Black thinkers, Black music is integral and constitutive of wrestling with what it means to be human.
Yeah.
Anybody who engages in the fallible quest for truth and beauty and goodness and holy, whatever tradition you come from, you're going to be grounded in your ROOTS, your roots. But the routes that you take, the ROUTES, is going to be headed toward the most fundamental efforts to make sense of meaning in the world. That's a variety of different religions, a variety of different philosophers. Within the West, that means you're starting with Plato. There's no way around it. I mean, what's distinctive about my own tradition of Black folk is that, the best of what we have been able to do is to deal with 400 years of being chronically hated and yet still teach the world so much about love. So Martin Luther King's love ethic, John Coltrane's love supreme, Stevie Wonder's love and need of love. We can go on and on and on. Same is true in terms of being traumatized, we teach the world about healing. Terrorized, teach the world about freedom for everybody. Wrestling with the depths of sorrow, teach the world about joy. Look at all the joy in Louis Armstrong. Look at all the joy in Richard Pryor. It's like the Bel Shem Tov in the Jewish tradition, overflowing with joy, because Jews themselves hated, terrorized, traumatized, teaching the world so much about justice, teaching the world so much about joy.
Right.
And there's a whole host of historic peoples who have made these kinds of contributions. I'm just using these 2 examples of Black folk and Jewish folk here. I mean, my God, we can go on and on with a variety of different cultures: Persians, Irish,
Sure,
and so forth. Just in the West, I mean, in the East, and in the African indigenous peoples, and so forth, have their own very rich and deep traditions. But I'm thinking of myself as a Black man born in Jim Crow America in the 50s. How am I going to make sense of the world?
yeah,
And I have access to, first, this Black church and the West family, Irene Cliff, and I have access to the music, the Curtis Mayfields, the Aretha Franklin, John Coltrane's, and Sarah Vaughan's. I have access to American tradition of Faulkner and Twain and Henry James and Baldwin and so forth. And I have access to the best of the West,
right.
where we started before, Shakespeare and Dante and Goethe and Beethoven and Schiller. Plato sitting at the bottom, but then Proclus and Plotinus playing fundamental roles. And of course, I don't want to downplay Aristotle here and St. Thomas. But all of these folk mean so much. Why? Because they invested so much of their genius and heart and soul trying to make sense of the world.
That's right.
That's a beautiful thing. If I'm going to play the violin and can't say a word about hyphus, I need to put the violin down.
Yeah.
If I'm going to play the piano and can't say a word about Chopin,
Yeah.
or Art Tatum, or Mary Lou Williams, or Liszt, Franz Liszt. I got to put this piano, move away from the piano and pick up the flute.
Yeah.
The band in the Republic. He said, now, so you got to deal with the best. You know what I mean? If you're going to play basketball, you got to come to terms with Michael Jordan and
That's right.
Dr. J and
Yeah.
LeBron and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really nice way to put it. And I would only add to that Plato or Homer, they're equally alien to you and to me. Now, based on our skin colors, that's not what I'm talking. I'm saying neither of us lived 2,000 years ago.
Truth.
Neither of us wears togas and walks around. Neither of us, as Achilles did, rages with our sword and shield.
That's right.
So you and I listen to the same music. We use the same phone. We read the same newspaper. We travel in the same cars. You and me, we got some life experience commonality together despite our background differences. Neither of us knows what the heck was going on with a sword and a shield in our hand on the battlefield, cutting men's throats and cutting off arms.
That's true.
So, I mean, no matter who you are, no matter where you come from, these books are disorienting. They are alien to you because they have a more profound axis of difference than almost any difference we could come up with today, just on account of the chronological distance that's passed.
That's
right. They're pre-Christian, for crying out loud.
That's
so,
exactly right.
I think in that way, they're great equalizers. You and I both are in universities. Universities are sick today. There's no question about that. And you and one of my colleagues and friends, Professor Robert George,
traveled the country. Dear brother. Absolutely.
Travel the country talking about that.
That's right.
What do you think universities have lost with respect to the Platonic spirit? You just talked about, the whole, understanding the whole and sitting with the longings of your soul and these sorts of things. I wonder if universities still do that, still call back to and represent accurately the Platonic origin of the academy, right? I wonder if you have thoughts on the return of the universities to the Platonic spirit.
I mean, Harvard's motto is veritas, truth. Good God Almighty, what audacity. But Harvard is just one example. It's the peak of an iceberg that the universities, especially the elite universities, have become so corporatized. Presidents are CEOs rather than moral leaders. That the administration becomes center rather than students and faculty. It's become so commodified because they're mainly looking for money, not just from the government, but from private wealth.
Yeah.
They become so thoroughly obsessed with ongoing fashions rather than being Socratic, which is always being suspicious of any fashion, including itself.
Yeah.
See, Socrates is actually critical of himself.
That's right.
See, so skepticism has to be skeptical about skepticism.
Right.
There's a difference between retail skepticism and wholesale skepticism.
That's right.
Wholesale skepticism is nihilism. But retail skepticism is healthy forms of criticism.
Right.
But you're looking for an alternative. Wholesale skepticism doesn't allow you. So what happens in the university these days, it becomes reduced to how much money you have, what your reputation is, what your image is. And you got these precious students coming through hungry for a quest for truth, beauty, goodness, and the holy, and they're being shaped into what? Pre-professional subjects. As soon as they arrive, what are you majoring in? Major tied to what? Tied to the job you're going to get. Well, you've got to make a choice. Choice between what? We're highly specialized. What are you going to major in? Well, I'm STEM. Well, if you're STEM, are you going to read Plato's Republic? Well, why should I read that? I'm concerned about science and technology and mathematics. How are you going to live your life? What kind of human being you going to be? How are you going to be courageous in moments of crisis? How are you going to understand the sense of the whole? Sense of the whole is lost. It's a very sad affair.
Yeah.
But the good news is that Socratic spirit is not dead.
Yeah.
It's not dead. And the legacy of Plato at its best is not dead. And the legacy of Plato at its worst is very much tied to the worst inside of us.
Right.
And so in that sense, the very fact that you have this show is an effort to keep alive the Socratic legacy at a moment in which the American empire with organized greed and weaponized hatred and institutionalized indifference toward the vulnerable makes it more and more difficult to people even want to generate trust with each other. That's what Brother Robbie and I try to do. We exemplify a certain kind of trust. We love each other, respect each other. He's deeply conservative, Republican, Catholic, and I don't know, whatever I am. I'm just revolutionary Christian, I guess, trying to make sense of the whole world. As I was telling you the other day, cracked vessel, just trying to love my crooked neighbor with my crooked heart, but it means that we can't give up.
That's one of the beautiful things about the Republic is it's a book when you have tragedy in your life. Maybe one of your loved ones is diagnosed with an illness that you didn't foresee. Your wife divorces you. You get laid off from your job. The bad things that can happen to you. You lose a child.
That's right.
It's a book like the Bible, like so many truly, truly extraordinary books that you can fall back on and seek wisdom in for how to deal with those sorts of problems in human life that technical education, you mentioned STEM, that technical education alone doesn't prepare you for. You're not going to program your way out of a divorce. You're not going to code your way out of losing a child. You need something that's sustaining to fall back on, in the kind of book that the Republic is, that the Bible is. You mentioned Shakespeare, Kierkegaard. Those are the kinds of books that can sustain the hunger that a soul needs to sustain in order to navigate those aspects of human life, which are the most
so true.
serious.
That's eloquently put, my brother.
Yeah.
And that's part of that call for help I was talking about.
That's right. That's right. So one of the things I asked you to do is give us a passage from the Republic that you think is profound, that we ought to read out loud, talk about, and focus on. One of your favorite passages.
Let me first do this. Let me put it in context. The Republic is structured in such a way that there is the Piraeus of the prologue. That first kind of being, I went down yesterday, descent.
That's right.
And it's going down into Hades, the hell for him, democracy.
Yeah.
Because Piraeus is the site of commerce and democracy. And so I went down yesterday to Piraeus. And then there's the epilogue of Hades itself, from the myth of error, where you actually goes down after 10 days of being a corpse and comes back to life 2 days later, and then tells everybody what the underworld is like. The sense of going down into darkness, crucial. The night festival of Bendis and Hecate, who is actually a figure who invites the people into the underworld. That is precisely the kind of festival that Socrates has just attended. So when people are interested in dealing with night-like situations in their lives, and then find themselves right at the center of chapter 7, the cave of the parable.
Mm-hmm.
The cave of the parable. Maybe I should
The allegory of the cave.
Exactly.
Well, it's interesting because you mentioned the book begins with the words, I went down. And of course, the cave is underground. And so it seems to begin with the allegory, or at least foreshadowing.
But you got all three of those connected.
That's right. That's right.
You got Piraeus,
Yeah.
You got Hades, and you've got the cave. Now, I will read a little bit of the cave here. Compare our nature in respect of education and its lack to such an experience as this. Picture men dwelling in a sort of subterranean cavern with a long entrance open to the light on its entire width. Conceive them as having their legs and necks fettered from childhood, so they remain in the same spot, able to look forward only and prevented by the fetters from turning their heads. Picture further the light from a fire burning higher up and at a distance behind them and between the fire and the prisoners, and above them a road along which a low wall has been built, as the exhibitors of puppet shows have partitions before the men themselves, above which they show the puppets. And it goes on and on and on. But the crucial thing is, and this is where I want to provide some light for our dear brothers and sisters, especially the younger generation, but it's for older folk like myself too. And you turn, for example, to line 368C, my brother.
Okay.
Which is in book 2, 368.
Got it.
And this is where, with Glaucon, who is historically, of course, Plato's brother. It says, Glaucon besought me, this is saying Plato, by all means come to the rescue. See, that's the response to the help.
Yeah.
Darkness of Piraeus, the darkness of the cave, and the darkness of the mist of air.
Right.
Which must come to help. And what is it coming to help? It is philosophy. But what does philosophy do? What the rescue is, it is Socratic dialectic in motion.
Yeah.
And it's in movement that affects people's hearts and minds and souls and bodies. And the culmination, actually, is, and I'll stop here now because I'm just going much too long here. But the culmination, and this to me is one of the more sublime moments of the Republic. But our present argument indicates that the true analogy for this indwelling power in the soul and the instrument whereby each of us apprehends is that of an eye that cannot be converted to light from the darkness except by the pedagogue, turning the whole body. Even so, this organ of knowledge must be turned around. Now, see, that's metanoia. Now, Christians might call it conversion. Ovid might call it metamorphosis. How do you come up with ways of getting people to see the world differently, to feel more deeply, to have more compassion and more courage, because it looks as if forms of blindness, forms of indifference, and forms of cowardliness are running amok. Mm-hmm. That's not just 2025. That's 368 BC. Plato was simply saying there's always got to be conditions under which a turning of the soul, new ways of perceiving, new ways of living, new ways of loving, new ways of engaging people, sustaining people. It's like the 32nd chapter of Genesis in Hebrew scripture where Jacob does what? In the night, just like here, wrestles with the angel of death, wounded, scarred, bruised, emerges with new energy, new vision, new name. And it's interesting, Israel means God wrestling. Boy, that's a heavy name for any people, a nation, or what. Are you going to wrestle with God enough to make sure you're pursuing justice for everybody and telling the truth? Every nation state, every empire falls short.
Right.
Plato's project, thought experiment, falls short.
Yeah.
It really does.
Yeah.
You see, that's why, in so many ways, as a jazz man, I read this text and I can see the unbelievable power and spirit that affects my way of being, because I'm forever wanting to continue my turning of the soul. And it is a form of death. It really is. It is a form of death, because anytime you give up on certain forms of blindness, certain assumptions and presuppositions and dogma, and let them go, you are dying in order to live better.
Right.
So there is no rebirth without death. There's no learning how to live without learning how to die.
Right.
And the learning how to die unlearns slavery, because it's free. This is freedom that he's talking about. No matter how authoritarian people might think the thought experiment is, he's talking about an intellectual and spiritual freedom here, though, man.
Sure.
And you can imagine, Duke Ellington would appreciate that.
Yeah.
He's got a freedom.
It seems to me what you brought out in the quotes that you've shared with us is that the Republic is in a way the beginning of what we would call liberal education. And by that, I mean what you've just said. It challenges us to call into question our deepest held convictions and either defend them or adopt new ones. And that's what you have in mind by the death. That if you call into question your deepest held convictions and you find that they don't hold water, you have to shed them. But when you shed them, the person you were when you hold those convictions dies.
That's right.
And so that's why I think the Republic is, in a course like a freshman seminar, sort of the best book you can read, because it is instantiated in these pages is the full spirit of a liberal education. And it's really beautiful, the second quote you shared with us, where Socrates says, Glaucon, if you're not satisfied with my defense of justice, I want to come to justice's assistance. I want to help justice. Why would you not want to defend justice? It's on me, because justice is good and true and right, to make sure that its full luminosity shines forth to you so that you see that it's better. Let's continue forward. Put this burden on me, Glaucon. And so I just think, Socrates as teacher, the message of the Republic as liberal education, it really is the beginning of so much.
Absolutely. Yeah. But there's two things to keep in mind, my dear brother. One is that, you see, when we use the phrase liberal education, these days people associate that with a liberalism.
No, I mean liberating, freeing.
There you go. That's it. I just call it Socratic.
Yeah. I mean the liberating education.
And I know, I just want to make that clear.
Just to be clear to everybody.
The young
freedom. Freedom of the mind.
And when he's talking about justice, you see, it's not just juridical And it's not just legal.
That's right.
It's
That's
not
right.
just political
You're
in
right.
a narrow sense. It's justifying one's own existence so you don't kill yourself tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
It's justifying your relation to your mama and your daddy and acknowledging what they poured into you that sustains you as you deal with your own crisis and catastrophe. So it's justification in the existential sense, the way Job is looking for justice and justification. He's not just looking for some juridical standing. He's looking for meaning in life at the deepest level. Fleshified, concretized, enacted, and embodied in his life. That's already in Plato. Most of our academic philosophers with the language games.
No, they got no idea.
I mean, they're brilliant. I mean, I ain't got nothing against brilliance and cleverness.
Yeah.
Fine, but they're not dealing at the level
It's
that
cheap.
Plato is.
It's cheap.
But you get with Nietzsche and Montaigne and Kierkegaard and Wittgenstein and Whitehead and others. That's a different situation.
Yeah. It's blood. It's blood on the page versus,
Blood
games on the page. That's the difference.
Exactly. Right. But, I would argue in the end that the musicians are deeper than the philosophers.
Is it because they express something that language and reason alone can't express? In other words, there's divine inspiration there, and that reason has its limits with respect to what it can say about the world? I mean, you have something like that.
That's a strong part of it, brother.
Yeah.
It really is the limits of language, the limits of words, and the knowledge of the limits of language. You can use language to acknowledge the limits of language in that way, whereas music has a way of getting at things that cut deeper than, and of course, this is something that Schopenhauer probably understood better than most philosophers of the West. And Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy is...
It's why Plato bans it at the beginning, right? Because music can make citizens do things that one might not want them to do.
Disorderly.
So it can make someone courageous. It can make someone feel things that the situation in which they're in gives them no reason to feel. You go to the gym, you listen to music, you feel like you want to go to war, but that's only because the music's playing. Were you at home sitting in silence, you would not feel that.
No,
and so
it's
the
true.
music provides you an occasion to feel feelings that you wouldn't have stimuli to feel otherwise.
But he does allow...
You got to ban it.
He allows for the lyre, though.
Yeah.
See, he eliminates the flute, but he allows for the lyre. It's got that one string.
Yeah.
See, because that one string he thinks is going to minimize the appeal to the appetites, the non-rational, the irrational. You're absolutely right. But I mean, it's interesting. When Plato died, we were told, of course, again, these are all the tales told, that there's a Thracian girl who was playing the melody with the flute, and she can't get it right. So Plato it's almost like James Brown trying to get Bootsy Collins to stay on the one. He's trying to get the girl to stay in rhythm while she's playing the flute.
Right.
And what's beneath his pillow? Aristophanes.
Yeah.
Who had made fun of his master, Socrates.
A great poet, yeah.
Absolutely. But the comic.
Yeah.
The comic poet. Absolutely. So you say, so Plato, your life, like every life, is so much more complicated and complex than one would have thought, as put forward in so much of your philosophy. But there's nobody like him, man. Let's just be honest about it.
Let's turn to a lightning round. These will be quick answer questions.
Oh, okay.
Can you name a book that you just simply couldn't finish? You just thought, I can't do it.
Ulysses.
Really?
Joyce. Mm-hmm. I was just overwhelmed by overwhelmed both by the linguistic genius, but also by just the plethora of words. It just kept coming. And I couldn't make sense of it. I stayed with it. I joined the little groups, thought we could read it together. Couldn't do it.
Who should the Democrats run in 2028?
I think the Democratic Party is beyond redemption.
All right.
So it's not a question of who they come up with. They got to get their act together at such a deep level that I think that institutionally they're incapable of doing that. So I think they're beyond redemption.
So given that the Democrats are beyond redemption, is there anything that the right gets correct about America? that you think is?
Well, I mean, Republicans far beyond redemption too, but
Okay.
but when you think about the right, you're never talking about a monolithic, homogeneous
Yeah.
group
Yeah.
at all. I have much to preserve and conserve, so I never want conservatives to think they have a monopoly on conserving things.
All right.
But I just think the level and depth of corruption of our system is such that it's difficult to conceive of either one of these parties reconfiguring themselves. They're playing on a superficial level with messaging, and we need something so much more deeper.
Let me ask you this. The philosopher king doesn't want to rule. You ran for office. Would you run again? And are you a philosopher king?
No. No, I'm a Christian, no, brother. Christians have a king who's a servant who dies on the cross because he loves so and was willing to give his all to empty himself in an act of kenosis. That's my tradition.
You got a desert island album, one that you take, that's the one that you listen to on repeat? It's the only one you got?
Ooh. Boy, that's a choice between Opus 111, the last sonata of Beethoven, or Opus 131, the last string quartet of Beethoven, or Marvin Gaye's What's Going On.
Maybe we can take them
call.
both.
Maybe we can take all three of them.
Yeah.
Put them all on the
Just
same
at the same time. Even. Mix them together.
Exactly.
Yeah. And this will be
Exactly.
the last one. What gives you hope today? What inspires you today?
Oh, I think all of us in the end have a sanctity and the dignity that the world didn't give us and the world can't take away. And the hope that I have in me has everything to do with the love and courage and hope that's poured into me by Irene and Clifton and West household where I grew up. The traditions that we talk about, towering figures who gave so much, sacrifice so much, they are inside of me. They soak inside of me. They are embedded, and I try to enact it. And it means whether I'm in jail or in a classroom or marching or giving a speech or trying to sing a song in the shower, I am fundamentally who I am because somebody loved me, and that can never be taken away, and therefore that is hope, and hope is always a verb as well as a virtue.
Cornel West, thank you so much
Brother, this
for
has
being
been
here.
wonderful, man. I salute you,
Wonderful.
brother.
My pleasure. Thank you for coming.
Definitely.